Unit 2, Activity 38, Diffusion in Cells. Write this on the top of your focus notes. This is phase 1. Remember, phase 1 is just taking notes to answer the guiding question. Your guiding question is your essential question. The essential question is, what is diffusion? And what are the factors that affect the rate of diffusion of a particular particle, of a particle from one point to another? Once again, your essential question is, what is diffusion and what are the factors that affect the rate of diffusion of a particle from one point to another? This is what you need to be writing on the top of your focus notes. Cell transport. Remember, the function of the membrane is to regulate what enters and exits the cell. This helps to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is where everything is happy. Homeostasis is when you sweat because you get too hot, or when insulin is produced because the blood sugar gets too much in your blood. That is homeostasis. Homeostasis is a balancing act where everything stays at the perfect spot, kind of like the Goldilocks syndrome. It's just right. Cell transport refers to the movement into and out of the cell. This is what we talked about earlier this week. Make sure that if you do not have those notes, that you go back and get those notes about cell transport and the movement into and out of the cell. Concentration. Concentration is the number of molecules of a substance in a given area. We will compare concentrations outside of a cell with the inside of a cell. If those concentrations differ, it is a concentration gradient. The difference in concentration from one area to another. That is the definition of a concentration gradient. The difference in concentration from one area to another. An area of high concentration has more molecules compared to one of low concentration that has less. Diffusing molecules will eventually reach what they call equilibrium. This is where everything is equal. This occurs when the molecules are evenly spread out and there is no longer an area of high or low concentration. They are equal on both sides, are equal throughout. Diffusion is the movement of molecules from a high concentration to a low concentration. Molecules always move down the concentration gradient. In other words, they always move from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. Molecules move straight through the membrane, as shown in this picture here. They move from a higher concentration where there is more molecules to an area of lower concentration where there is less molecules. No energy is required for diffusion. Simple versus facilitated diffusion. Most diffusion in biological systems occurs across membranes. Simple diffusion occurs directly across a membrane, where facilitated diffusion involves helper proteins. Neither requires the cell to expend energy. So if you look at this picture down here, Simple diffusion is just simply moving across the membrane without any type of assistance. Once again, not using any type of energy. Facilitated diffusion is using a carrier protein. We talked about this when we talked about plasma membranes, carrier proteins, to allow large lipids to move across the membrane. Once again, no energy is being used. Facilitated diffusion uses these channel proteins. These were the ones that look like hot dog buns. They are a pore, which is an opening in the plasma membrane or in the membrane that allows these ions to be able to go across or through the membrane. Once again, not using any type of energy. Factors that affect the rate of diffusion. There are several factors that affect the rate of diffusion. The first factor is the concentration gradient. A concentration gradient is diffusion rate is higher when there is a greater concentration difference between two regions. In other words, if there's more molecules on one side than there is on the other side, it will affect the rate of diffusion. It will cause it to diffuse faster from one side to the other because it wants to reach that rate or that set of equilibrium as quickly as possible. The next factor is the distance moved. Diffusion that occurs at a greater rate over shorter distances than over larger distances. So in other words, if the diffusion has to occur over a long distance, it takes longer than if it has to occur over a very short distance. A short distance diffusion will occur very quickly. Another factor that affects diffusion is the surface area involved. The larger the area across which diffusion occurs, the greater the rate of diffusion. So if there's more surface area, the diffusion will be faster. It'll be at a greater rate. The next factor of diffusion is barriers to diffusion. The rate of diffusion is slower if the barrier is thicker than a thin barrier. So a very narrow or thin barrier will allow diffusion to be faster than a thick barrier. That will be a slow diffusion across a thick barrier. The next factor that affects diffusion is temperature. The rate of diffusion increases with temperature. So this is why if you have some cold tea and you add sugar to it, it takes it a lot longer for that sugar to dissolve and spread throughout the glass of cold tea. Where if you have tea that is warm or hot, that diffusion will happen at a faster rate. Unit 2, Activity 40. We are going to go ahead and talk about diffusion and cell size. Since we're already talking about diffusion, we're going to go ahead and add Activity 40 into this and go into diffusion and cell size. Remember when we did our focus note taking and we learned about how we could divide our notes up if we changed subjects or we went into a different content area or a different context. This would be an area that you might want to change are marked differently because it is a different content area. We've been talking about diffusion. Now we're talking about how diffusion is affected by the cell size. Once again, write your essential question down. Remember, your essential question is your guiding question. You are wanting to answer this question. You write down information that answers this question. How does the surface area to volume ratio of a cell affect how substances diffuse into the cell's center? In single-celled organisms, diffusion is much more effective and the cell's requirements are easily met. In a larger multicellular organism, specialized body systems are needed to transport materials to and from cell tissues. This right here is a single-celled organism, an amoeba. And this amoeba, because it is a single-celled, it is much more efficient and effective at diffusion and being able to have its requirements met. This elephant, which is a multicellular organism, it has to have special body requirements to help make sure that diffusion goes from all the way to the outside, to the inside of the body. As an object becomes larger, its surface area to volume ratio decreases and diffusion becomes less effective way to transport materials inside. So in other words, the larger it becomes, then diffusion is decreased and is not as effective. It's harder to get from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell as an object becomes larger. This affects the ability of a cell to make efficient exchanges with the environment. The effectiveness of diffusion is the controlling factor determining how big an individual cell can become. Okay, I'm going to repeat that because if you notice it is bold, probably something to make sure that you know. The effectiveness of diffusion is the controlling factor of how big an individual cell can become. A single-celled organism, such as the amoeba pictured, they are small, but they have a large surface area relative to the cell's volume. The cell's requirement can be met by the diffusion or active transport of materials into and out of the cell. In other words, it's a very small organism. It is a single cell. Well, it's not single cell, but it's a very small organism, and so it is very easy for material to transport in and out of this cell. And very easy for oxygen and food to go in, carbon dioxide, heat, and other metabolic waste to leave because it is a very small celled object. Large multicellular organisms, such as plants and animals, generally have a small surface area compared to their volume. In most multicellular organisms, the body's needs for respiratory gases cannot be met by diffusion through the skin. Specialized body systems, such as our lungs and our circulatory system, are required to transport the materials they need to and from the cells and tissues in their body. In other words, it can't just happen through our skin because there is too much volume to us. There's too much of us to go from just the inside of us to the outside of us quickly and efficiently. So that is why we need our lungs and our circulatory system to be able to transport materials in and out quickly and easily. Here we have a picture of a horse. A specialized gas exchange surface, such as the lungs and circulatory blood system, are required to supply the body cells with oxygen and remove CO2. This is why when we inhale oxygen, it goes into our lungs. It is exchanged with the blood in our heart. It is then transported out into our vessels, veins, capillaries, arteries, and is exchanged out into the cells. Carbon dioxide is then transported back, the waste is transported back into the veins, the vessels, the capillaries, the arteries, back into the heart, back into the lungs, where it is then sent back out the respiratory system as carbon dioxide. Key idea. Okay, so this is our main takeaway of surface volume and diffusion. Probably pretty much your main idea. Surface area is the cell's outer membrane where substances enter. Volume is the space inside the cell that those substances must fill. As a cell grows, its volume increases much faster than its surface area. Small cells, large surface area compared to its volume. Lots of doors for molecules to get in and a short distance to the center. Diffusion is fast. Big cell. Surface area grows slower, fewer doors per unit of volume, and molecules have further to travel. Diffusion is slow. Bottom line, a higher surface area to volume ratio lets substances diffuse quickly to the center, keeping the cell healthy. When cells get too big, diffusion can't keep up, which is why cells divide or stay small.